In my previous Wahaika video, I said we'd get to see another example, and we are ready. First, some great traditional art from a traditional Maori meeting place. I got to see 5 authentic Maori antiques, so I need to mix it up a little bit. Here's the interior of a typical space. And not to retread too much, but yeah, a very notable society and warrior society, even though it's a very small one in terms of global population or anything like that, because we're talking about the indigenous population of New Zealand. Here's the first Wahaika I got to show you as a reminder, and here is the second one. Interesting to note the differences. Clearly the same overall weapon type, and clearly also made out of whalebone. So I'd always wanted to see and handle just one Wahaika made out of whalebone, so got to do 2. And this is a heavy slashing and thrusting weapon, obviously used for close quarters combat. It's one of the major types of short Maori clubs, but as far as I can tell, it's the least common of the major types. Based on photographic evidence and museum collections, this middle type here is far more common. That's a košiate, closely related implement. And then on the right you have a patu, which is a word for that kind of club, but also any Maori short club in general. I'm simplifying, but I think that'll do for our purposes. So, scrolling down from these patus here, you're going to see some different types, and what's interesting is they specifically show our type, a Wahaika with that notch in the middle. You see that? It's the second from the right, and it's classified as a, quote, Wahaika with side notch. I had one subscriber mention how similar that version looks, how related, I should say, it looks to the košiate, and yeah, that does seem suspicious, like there's got to be some shared DNA there. Of course, all of these weapons do, really. So notice both Wahaikas in this illustration have that kind of mythic figure carved into the back of the handle. Well, here's the one on our specimen. Interesting how the war and or protective deity looks back at you, the way the design is. This one is really wicked looking too. I'll give you a much better view. First a close-up. It has almost an, I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, of course, but almost like an alien, like UFO aesthetic to it, just that kind of humanoid. So you really have to go to profile to see how awesome this thing looks, so let's do that. The analogous figure on the last Wahaika I saw, the previous video, was very different, like much more totem-like, to like just an easy, lazy Western thing to say, but that's what it looked like, and it wasn't this elongated or thin. It didn't have these empty spaces going through it. The way the figure emerges from the body of the weapon, I think, is awesome. Yeah, I could just look at that all day, but we're gonna need to move on, so a little bit of a final lingering look. I really like that. And let's get to the tip. So that spatula shape, you can see the notch on the left, not the košiate-like one that bisects the striking surface, but the one on the back. It's probably the main feature that gives these their name, Mouth of the Fish. Probably refers to the overall outline, which is mostly made by that large cutout. I'm obviously focusing on the pommel here. It almost always swells out. This looks pretty typical, and that's going to help with retention, right? If it's trying to slip out of your hand, that swelling is going to help keep it from slipping through your fingers, right, in the direction of my thumb. You'll also notice the hole bored through the center, right by my pinky. That's where the thong would be wrapped through, as seen here. And of course, this is your main retention system, but a big loop like that is only going to come in handy if you completely lose control of the weapon. Then at least it's still dangling from your wrist and you can snatch it back up. Unless you use a technique, which funny enough, I've shown with kind of my specialty, saps and blackjacks, and I know for a fact the Maori used with the Wahaika. So, got a little blackjack here, big loop. Some of you have seen this before. And you get a very tight wrap around the fist, so it's going to be really hard to lose the weapon now. In some of the demonstrations you can see online, it's cool because the loop is so much longer with these kinds of weapons here that it really spins around. You would need to do that before you get close and engage with the enemy, of course. But it serves kind of a dual purpose if you do that. One, it's retaining the weapon, putting it more firmly in place, but also part of that pre-battle show-off. One of the things that surprises me when it comes to techniques with this, some of these are hooked so strongly, like this one here. You would think there'd be a lot of cool fighting techniques you could do, grabbing, pulling, hooking, if you reversed it, right? Grab them behind the knee and do a push-pull to send them to the ground, all kinds of stuff. Well, one, I've never seen a historic example that's this deeply curved. So the shallower the curve, the less practical that becomes. But even with this one here, it looks like you could do that, and the following example as well. But it might just be that there's no remaining evidence of it getting used that way, even though once in a while somebody did that. It could also be that they simply just preferred not to, because, you'd rather strike with the sharpened edge, which is kind of the main use, of course. Here's a fantastic example from a museum in Switzerland, and while we look at it and its back-swept notch, some say that was used for hooking an opponent's weapon. With kind of a backwards pulling motion, and that could definitely be the utilitarian aspect of that design. The advantage with that is that you would always keep the weapon in the same grip. If you used it like a kama, like I was talking about a second ago with the hook forward, well, you'd have to reverse your grip to do that. As I mentioned in my last video, these things are heavy, heavier than you might think. That whalebone is really dense, and because of the flat, large shape, most of the weight is not in your hand. I mean, think about it. You're only grabbing, an extremity and trying to control the whole thing, so there's kind of a leverage factor that you feel in your hand. I mean, it feels more like you're holding a sword, really, than what you would think. You might think it feels more like a short club in your hand. Here you can see the traditional Maori tongue-out face, right? The battle look, and the actual edge, the thrusting edge of the one he's holding. So that's what it might look like up close in a scrape. Here you can notice how much these things swell towards the center as you come in from all directions. So that gives it a lot more mass, a lot more weight. Like I was talking about, they're heavier than you think. These are not, a fan-shaped, really flat object. The grain, if you want to call it that, on these just looks so incredibly cool. When they're made out of actual whalebone, as a reminder, these could be wood as well, and that was, not going to give you as heavy of an object, but one that's easier to carve, so sometimes the wooden ones are really elaborately carved. As I work my way up here, you'll notice that when we get to the tip, it's sharpened just as much as the main cutting surface. If this was a knife, think of the cutting surface. Well, here on the spatula tip, it's sharpened just as much. Now, back to this notch here, the cruciate-like notch. One of the theories is that this is to help with a ripping motion of the opponent's flesh, because, bone can only be made so sharp, it's not metal, so maybe that would facilitate doing damage when you draw it across a body with a slashing swing. Could be. Here's an up close of the pommel, haven't provided that yet. I showed it in my hand, but not like this. Remember how much work went into one of these, because there was no metal to be found on New Zealand. All the carving then had to be done with rocks, shells, objects like that, so painstaking work. And that was the edge, obviously, and we'll finish up with one last look at this beauty of an antique. A lot of variation in these, even though the form is consistent. Notice here that the backside cutout is almost like a full crescent shape, and that is not typical. And there it is, a second antique Maori Wahaika. Thanks a lot.